South Africa's new visa restrictions on travelers from the United States and the European Union would not remain a bureaucratic footnote. They would ripple outward, touching tourism, diplomacy, trade, and the fragile balance of global relationships. For decades, South Africa has been one of the most accessible destinations on the African continent for Western tourists. Americans and Europeans have flown in without visas for short stays, filling hotels in Cape Town, safaris in Kruger, vineyards in Stellenbosch, and business conferences in Johannesburg. That ease of entry was more than convenience. It was symbolic, a signal of openness rooted in post-apartheid reintegration into the global community. Now, that assumption of easy access has been interrupted. Under the new rules, travelers from the United States and several European Union countries are required to obtain visas before arrival, adding paperwork, waiting periods, and uncertainty. Officials in Pretoria insist the move is administrative, part of a broader overhaul of immigration controls aimed at security, reciprocity, and modernization. But abroad, the reaction has been swift and uneasy. In Washington, State Department officials have acknowledged the change while seeking clarification. In Brussels, diplomats have quietly expressed concern about precedent and reciprocity. Tourism operators on 3 continents are recalculating bookings. Airlines are adjusting passenger advisories. And behind closed doors, questions are being asked about what this moment says about South Africa's foreign policy direction. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand how deeply tourism and diplomacy intertwine. Tourism is not just leisure. It is soft power. Each visa exemption is an invitation. Each border rule a statement about trust. When a country tightens access to long-standing partners, it is rarely viewed as neutral, even when the stated reasons are technical. South African officials argue that the visa changes are long overdue. The country has faced persistent challenges related to undocumented migration, visa overstays, and administrative backlogs. Digital visa systems, biometric requirements, and reciprocal arrangements have all been under review. From this perspective, applying new rules to Americans and Europeans simply closes a gap that had been politically sensitive but practically inconsistent. The decision comes at a moment when South Africa's relationships with Western powers are already under strain. Disagreements over foreign policy alignment, particularly regarding conflicts beyond Africa, have complicated diplomatic exchanges. Trade negotiations remain sensitive. Aid relationships are being reassessed. Against this backdrop, even a technical policy shift can be read as a political signal. Tourism officials inside South Africa have tried to strike a careful tone. They acknowledge the risk of short-term disruption but emphasize long-term sovereignty. Every country has the right to determine who enters and under what conditions, one senior official said privately. Visa-free access is a privilege, not an entitlement. That framing resonates with a growing sentiment across parts of the global South, that openness should not be assumed, and that reciprocity should be enforced. Many South Africans traveling to Europe or the United States already face lengthy visa processes, high fees, and rejection risks. In that sense, the new policy is being defended domestically as overdue symmetry. Tourism contributes significantly to South Africa's economy, supporting millions of jobs directly and indirectly. The United States and the European Union together account for a substantial share of high-spending visitors. Even modest friction at the border can deter travel, particularly for short trips, conferences, and spontaneous bookings. Industry groups have warned that perception alone can be damaging. Travelers often choose destinations based on ease. Competing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are watching closely, ready to capture diverted demand. Diplomatically, the concern is less about tourism numbers and more about trajectory. Western diplomats note that visa policy has historically been used as leverage, reward, or signal. When restrictions are imposed without extensive consultation, it raises questions about future cooperation in other areas, from trade preferences to security partnerships. South Africa, for its part, appears aware of the stakes. Officials have emphasized that the policy is not punitive and that discussions remain open. They point to ongoing engagement with U.S. and EU counterparts and stress that visas will be processed efficiently. Digital platforms, they say, will minimize friction. Still, the optics are difficult to ignore. In Washington, Lawmakers already skeptical of South Africa's foreign policy choices are citing the visa move as further evidence of drift. In Brussels, where migration, borders, and reciprocity are politically charged topics, the change complicates internal debates about how the EU should treat African partners. For South Africa, the challenge is balancing domestic priorities with international perception. The country has long positioned itself as a bridge between worlds, between North and South, East and West, developed and developing. Its diplomatic identity has rested on engagement rather than exclusion. Visa-free access for Western tourists was part of that image. Altering that access does not dismantle the bridge, but it does introduce tolls. Whether those tolls become temporary adjustments or lasting barriers will depend on what happens next. If processing is smooth, communication clear, and diplomacy proactive, the impact may fade. If delays mount and rhetoric hardens, the policy could become a symbol of deeper estrangement. What is already clear is that this decision is being watched closely, not only in Washington and Brussels, but across Africa and beyond. Other countries are asking what it means when one of the continent's most globally integrated states recalibrates its borders. Is this a signal of greater assertiveness, a push for reciprocity, or a warning that the era of assumed Western access is ending? For now, South Africa's government insists it is simply governing. But in a world where borders speak loudly, governance rarely goes unheard.
The initial reactions, measured as they were, soon began to give way to more candid assessments. Diplomats accustomed to reading between the lines noted that visa policy, while administrative on the surface, often reflects deeper recalculations. In private briefings, some Western officials described the move as unexpected but telling, a phrase that captures both surprise and concern without overt accusation. In South Africa, the domestic response has been more mixed. Some voices in civil society and business warn that the country cannot afford to alienate key tourism markets at a time when economic growth remains fragile. They argue that symbolism cuts both ways, and that asserting sovereignty should not come at the expense of livelihoods. Others, however, welcome the change as an assertion of dignity, long overdue in a world where mobility remains deeply unequal. That tension between economic pragmatism and political principle has long shaped South Africa's post-apartheid journey. The country emerged into global acceptance with goodwill and openness, but also with expectations placed upon it. Over time, those expectations have grown heavier, particularly as global politics have become more polarized. The visa decision, seen through this lens, becomes less about tourists and more about posture. South Africa has repeatedly signaled its desire to pursue an independent foreign policy, one not bound automatically to Western positions. That independence has sometimes placed it at odds with traditional partners, especially when global conflicts sharpen lines of allegiance. While officials deny any link between visa rules and foreign policy disputes, the broader context is impossible to ignore. In Brussels, where the European Union manages complex relationships with dozens of partner countries, the issue has sparked quiet debate about reciprocity and response. The EU prides itself on being rules-based, but it is also acutely aware of optics. Retaliatory measures would risk escalation. Silence could be interpreted as acquiescence. For now, European officials are choosing caution, emphasizing dialogue over reaction. Public statements have been restrained, focused on practicalities rather than politics. Privately, however, there is unease about precedent. If South Africa tightens access without penalty, others may follow. In Washington, the conversation is unfolding along familiar lines. Some see the decision as a technical matter best handled through diplomacy. Others view it as part of a broader pattern in which US influence in parts of Africa appears to be waning. For those voices, the visa change reinforces arguments for a tougher stance. Yet the reality is more complex. South Africa is not closing its borders. It is recalibrating them. Visas are not bans. They are filters. The distinction matters, particularly for policymakers who must decide whether this moment demands response or restraint. Tourism operators, meanwhile, operate on tighter timelines. Booking cycles are immediate. Travel insurers are revising policies. Conference organizers are weighing alternative venues. None of this amounts to crisis, but it does represent friction. And friction, in a competitive global tourism market, has consequences. South Africa's government insists those consequences are manageable. Officials point to plans for streamlined e-visa systems, faster processing times, and expanded diplomatic outreach. They argue that once the initial adjustment period passes, travelers will adapt, as they do elsewhere. They may be right. Many countries with strict visa regimes continue to attract millions of visitors. The key lies in execution. If visa applications are efficient, transparent, and predictable, the impact may be minimal. If they are slow, opaque, or inconsistent, frustration will grow, and reputational damage may follow. The diplomatic dimension adds another layer. Visas sit at the intersection of domestic authority and international expectation. They are among the few tools states wield unilaterally, yet they rarely operate in isolation. Trade agreements, security cooperation, cultural exchange, and development partnerships all exist within the same relational ecosystem. South Africa's partners are therefore assessing not only the policy itself, but what it suggests about future interactions. Is this an isolated adjustment, or part of a broader repositioning? Does it signal a more transactional approach to international relations? Or is it simply administrative housekeeping elevated by geopolitical sensitivity? Pretoria has so far resisted framing the move as symbolic. That restraint may be intentional, designed to avoid escalation. Yet symbolism has a way of asserting itself regardless of intent. In African capitals beyond South Africa, the decision is being watched with interest. Many countries face similar pressures, managing borders, asserting sovereignty, and navigating unequal mobility regimes. Some may see South Africa's move as precedent-setting, an example of pushing back without overt confrontation. For others, it may serve as a cautionary tale, illustrating the fine line between assertion and alienation. The global context only heightens these calculations. International travel is still stabilizing after years of disruption. Governments are reassessing border controls, digital identity systems, and security protocols. In this environment, changes are frequent, but trust remains fragile. South Africa's choice to include Western tourists in its new requirements places it firmly within this global recalibration. It suggests a willingness to apply uniform standards rather than carve out exceptions based on history or power. That, in itself, is a statement. Whether it becomes a point of friction or a footnote will depend on how all sides respond. Diplomacy, after all, is as much about interpretation as action. For now, the story continues to unfold quietly, through consular offices, airline desks, and diplomatic cables rather than street protests or emergency summits. Yet beneath that quiet, the implications are being weighed carefully. And so, as travelers adjust their plans and diplomats adjust their language, one thing is clear. The relationship between South Africa and its Western partners has entered a new phase, defined less by assumption and more by negotiation. As the days pass, the practical realities of the new visa regime begin to reveal themselves in small but telling ways. At South African consulates abroad, inquiries increase steadily. Some are routine, others edged with frustration. Travelers who have visited the country for years without paperwork now find themselves navigating forms, documentation requirements, and processing timelines they had never previously considered. For many, the change feels abrupt, not because visas are unusual in global travel, but because familiarity had bred expectation. South Africa, in the Western imagination, had come to occupy a space of assumed accessibility. That assumption is now being tested. Inside South Africa's Department of Home Affairs, officials describe the rollout as necessary modernization. They point to global standards, biometric verification, and the need to strengthen border integrity in a world of increasingly sophisticated transnational crime. From their perspective, the system had lagged behind reality, leaving gaps that were politically uncomfortable but administratively tolerated. The new approach, they argue, closes those gaps. Yet even among supporters of tighter controls, there is recognition that implementation will determine legitimacy. South Africa has struggled in the past with bureaucratic inefficiencies, system outages, and uneven service delivery. Any repeat of those issues under the new visa framework would quickly undermine confidence, both domestically and abroad. Business leaders are among the most attentive observers. South Africa relies heavily on international conferences, investment summits, and business travel, much of it originating from Europe and North America. For executives and investors, friction at the border can influence decisions about where to meet, where to invest, and where to expand. Some chambers of commerce have quietly raised concerns with government counterparts, urging clarity and flexibility, particularly for short-term business visitors. Officials have responded with assurances, but assurances alone may not be enough to counter hesitation in a competitive global environment. The tourism sector, still recovering from global disruptions, faces similar uncertainty. Luxury safari operators, boutique hotels, and tour companies catering primarily to Western clientele are recalibrating marketing strategies. Some are emphasizing assistance with visa applications, while others are diversifying toward new markets in Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. That diversification aligns with a broader strategic shift already underway. South Africa has been seeking to reduce reliance on traditional Western markets, both in tourism and trade. Emerging economies, regional integration, and South-South cooperation have featured prominently in policy discussions. Seen in that light, the visa change may be less disruptive than it appears. It may simply accelerate trends already in motion. Still, acceleration carries risk. Diplomatically, Western governments are balancing competing priorities. On one hand, they must respond to constituents affected by new travel requirements. On the other, they are wary of overreacting to what South Africa insists is an administrative decision. So far, the emphasis has been on dialogue rather than demand. Diplomatic notes have sought clarification rather than reversal. Public statements have been carefully worded to avoid escalation. This restraint reflects an understanding that visa disputes can spiral quickly. History offers numerous examples of tit-for-tat restrictions, each justified domestically, each damaging internationally. No one appears eager to trigger such a cycle. At the same time, silence is not neutrality. Behind closed doors, the policy is being logged, analyzed, and contextualized alongside other developments in South Africa's foreign relations. Patterns are being mapped. Signals are being interpreted. For South Africa, managing those interpretations will be as important as managing the visas themselves. The country's leadership has repeatedly emphasized its commitment to multilateralism, dialogue, and peaceful engagement. It has resisted pressure to align fully with any single bloc, preferring what it describes as principled non-alignment. That stance has earned both praise and criticism. The visa decision now becomes part of that narrative. Supporters see it as consistent, a sovereign choice made without deference to power. Critics see it as unnecessarily provocative, risking goodwill for limited gain. Between those views lies a more pragmatic assessment that South Africa is navigating a changing world in which assumptions no longer hold, and flexibility is essential. Mobility, once taken for granted among certain passports, is increasingly politicized. Security concerns, domestic pressures, and geopolitical competition are reshaping borders everywhere. South Africa is not immune to these forces. What makes this moment distinctive is not the policy itself, but who it affects. By extending visa requirements to Americans and Europeans, South Africa is challenging an unspoken hierarchy of movement. That challenge resonates far beyond its borders. In many parts of the world, particularly across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the move is being quietly noted as an assertion of parity. If citizens of the Global South face scrutiny abroad, why should scrutiny not be mutual? That question has long simmered beneath global mobility regimes. South Africa's policy brings it to the surface. Whether this sparks broader change remains to be seen. Most countries still calibrate visa rules based on economic, security, and diplomatic calculations. Ideals of symmetry often yield to pragmatism. Yet symbolism matters, especially when articulated through policy rather than rhetoric. For travelers planning future trips, the immediate concern is simple. What do the new rules require, and how long will they take? For diplomats, the concern is strategic. What does this say about South Africa's trajectory? For policymakers in Pretoria, the challenge is to ensure that intention aligns with outcome. If the system works smoothly, the policy may fade into routine. If it falters, it could harden perceptions and invite response. As weeks turn into months, data will begin to emerge. Application numbers, approval times, tourism flows, and diplomatic exchanges will offer clearer insight into impact. For now, Analysis is necessarily provisional. What is certain is that the decision has punctured complacency. It has reminded partners that access is conditional, relationships dynamic, and policy choices consequential. In international relations, moments of friction often reveal underlying realities more clearly than years of stability. This may be one such moment. South Africa has chosen to act, quietly but firmly. The world is now responding, cautiously but attentively. In that exchange lies the future shape of the relationship, not only between South Africa and the West, but between states navigating a world where borders are once again central to power.